In the spring of 2021, a wildland firefighter working a prescribed burn on a remote ridge in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park pulled a young animal from a pile of burning debris. He had been fighting fire in those mountains for the better part of 28 years. He had handled injured elk, relocated black bears, extracted copperheads from under equipment, and carried out a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing during a fire in Cades Cove. He thought he had seen every species the Smokies had to offer. What he pulled from that burning timber on Jesse Ridge above the Cataloochee Valley was not in any field guide published by the state of Tennessee or North Carolina or the National Park Service or anyone else. It was canine in structure, but wrong in every proportion. Too large for its apparent age, too long in the limb, a skull shape that did not match any native canid in the southern Appalachians. And when he freed it and straightened up and looked at the ridgeline above him, 6 of the adults were standing there, upright, on 2 legs, watching him with an intelligence he felt in his chest before his brain had time to process what his eyes were delivering. 6 dogmen, motionless against the smoke and the sky, watching a human handle one of their young. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe. Thanks. The man who told us this story agreed to share it on the condition that his real name not be used, given what he has to lose, given the pension, and the professional reputation, and the relationships with people he has worked alongside for decades. You will understand why. We will call him Roy. Roy grew up in Cocca County, Tennessee, in the shadow of the eastern Smokies, in a family that had been in those mountains for 5 generations. His grandfather logged the high ridges above Cosby before the Park Service acquired the land in the 1930s. His father ran heavy equipment for the county road department and hunted whitetail on the Cherokee National Forest every fall. Roy was in the backcountry before he could ride a bicycle. By the time he graduated from Cosby High School in the mid-'80s, he had hiked most of the trails on the Tennessee side of the park and a fair number on the North Carolina side. He knew the drainages and the ridgelines and the old home sites that the forest had swallowed since the park was established. He knew which hollows held water in August and which ones went dry by July. He knew where the bears denned on the north faces of the Balsam Range and where the turkeys roosted in the oaks above Cataloochee Creek. He knew the forest the way a person knows the hallways of a house they grew up in, by instinct and memory and the accumulated residue of a lifetime spent inside it. He applied to the Park Service in 1988 and was brought on as a GS-3 forestry technician on the engine crew out of Twin Creeks near Gatlinburg. He dug line with a Pulaski. He ran hose. He mopped up after prescribed burns in Cades Cove. He learned to read, smoke, and weather, and slope and fuel load. He converted to permanent status in the early 90s, worked his way to squad boss, qualified as an engine operator, and eventually became a senior firefighter on the park's wildland fire module. He carried a red card with qualifications in engine operations, firing operations, and crew leadership. He had been doing the work for close to 3 decades by the time the events on Jesse Ridge took place, and nobody in the park's fire program questioned his competence or his judgment. The Cataloochee Valley sits on the North Carolina side of the park in Haywood County, walled in by ridges that top 5,000 feet on 3 sides. Sterling Ridge to the northwest, the Cataloochee Divide to the southeast, marking the park boundary. Big Cataloochee Mountain to the southwest along the Balsam Crest, over 6,000 feet. The valley floor sits at roughly 2,700 feet. The terrain between the bottom and the crests is steep, densely forested, cut by drainages that run cold year-round, and in many places trailless. Stand on the Cataloochee Divide and look north, and you will see no road, no rooftop, no cleared field, nothing human at all for as far as the eye can carry. The Cherokee had a word for that view, Gadalutsi, standing in a row, wave upon wave of mountains. European settlers transformed it over time into Cataloochee. Cataloochee was once home to over 1,000 people. When the park was established in 1934, the residents were relocated. The valley emptied. The forest crept back. Today it is one of the least visited sections of the park, accessible only by a narrow, unpaved road that climbs from Interstate 40 over Cove Creek Gap and drops into the valley through hairpin turns with no guardrails. Most visitors white-knuckle the wheel the entire way in. Cell service does not exist in Cataloochee. The nearest town of any size is Waynesville, over 20 miles and a mountain range away. In winter and early spring, the access road closes regularly due to ice, snow, or mudslides. When the road is open, the valley sees a trickle of visitors compared to the millions who pour through Gatlinburg and Cades Cove on the Tennessee side. Most people who come to Cataloochee come for the elk. The park reintroduced Rocky Mountain elk to the valley beginning in 2001, and the herd has grown steadily. During the fall rut, the bulls bugle at dawn and dusk in the old fields where the homesteads used to be, and photographers line the road to capture them. Outside of elk season, Cataloochee is quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears, the kind that makes you aware of how much noise the rest of the world makes, and how little the forest makes when it does not want to. The prescribed burn that Roy's crew was assigned to in the spring of 2021 was part of the Canadian Top Prescribed Fire Plan, a long-term burn program the park has been executing in phases since 2013. The plan covers roughly 3,500 acres of ridgeline terrain surrounding the Cataloochee Valley, targeting the pine and mixed hardwood ecosystems on the upper slopes, where fire historically played a critical role in maintaining open woodland habitat. Decades of fire suppression had allowed shade-tolerant species like red maple and eastern hemlock to crowd out the fire-adapted oaks and Table Mountain pines that once dominated the ridges. Without fire to keep the understory in check, fuel had been building on those slopes for most of a century.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The prescribed burns were designed to push that balance back, reducing fuel loads, opening the canopy, and returning the forest to something closer to its historical condition. The burns were conducted in units, individual sections of ridgeline that the fire planners mapped and prepared with handline and natural fire breaks before igniting. Jesse Ridge, a spur ridge running southeast from Sterling Ridge above the main valley, was one of these units. Roy's module had been working prescribed burns in the Cataloochee area on and off for years. He knew the terrain. He knew the access routes, the water sources, the anchor points where fire crews could establish themselves safely, and the drainages that channeled wind and could accelerate a fire upslope faster than a person could move on foot. The Jesse Ridge burn was planned for late April, when conditions in the southern Appalachians typically offer a window of moderate temperatures, manageable humidity, and predictable wind before the spring greenup reduces fire behavior to the point where burning becomes ineffective. The unit was approximately 280 acres of south-facing slope, covered in mixed hardwoods, oak leaf litter, mountain laurel, and scattered Table Mountain pine. The fire was intended to back slowly down the slope from the ridgeline, consuming the leaf litter and understory while leaving the mature trees intact. Textbook prescribed fire, the kind Roy had done 100 times. The crew staged at Cove Creek Gap early on a Wednesday morning and hiked into the Jesse Ridge unit, about 90 minutes through rising terrain. They carried Pelasgus, McLeods, fusees, drip torches, and a portable pump. The module that day was 6 people. Roy was the senior member. The crew boss was a man we will call Mac, who had been with the fire program about 15 years. There was also a younger firefighter we will call Travis, in his 3rd season, who Roy had taken an interest in mentoring. They lit the ridge around 10 in the morning, dripped torches along the upper edge, letting the fire back down the south face. Temperature in the mid-50s, relative humidity around 40%, wind out of the northwest at 5 to 8, steady. The fire moved slowly, consuming leaf litter in a low, creeping flame that rarely topped 18 inches. Exactly what the plan called for, down in the valley. The elk grazed in the old Palmer fields, oblivious. By early afternoon, the crew had established good black along the ridgeline, and the fire was backing steadily downslope through the unit. Roy was working the eastern flank with Travis, monitoring the fire's edge where the burn unit bordered unburned timber along a drainage that dropped steeply toward Caldwell Fork. The flank was holding. The drainage created a natural moisture break that the fire was not crossing. Standard operations. Roy sent Travis back toward the ridge to check in with Mac and the rest of the crew, and he continued east along the flank by himself, walking the line, watching for spots that might have jumped the drainage and checking that the fire edge was clean. He was about a quarter mile from the rest of the crew when he heard the sound. Roy had been in the Smoky Mountains for the better part of 30 years. He knew what a black bear sounds like when it is stressed, when it is warning you off, when it has cubs nearby and wants you gone. He knew what a bobcat sounds like when it screams, a sound that stops your heart the first time you hear it and makes you check your surroundings the 100th time. He knew what a barred owl sounds like at midday, what a raven sounds like when it is mobbing a raptor, what a bull elk sounds like during the rut when the bugle carries for a mile through the hollows. He knew the forest vocabulary of the southern Appalachians, as well as any person alive. What he heard, coming from the downslope timber below the fire's edge, was not in that vocabulary. It was a vocalization, high-pitched, structured, and urgent. It came from below the fire line, maybe 80 yards downslope, somewhere in a tangle of deadfall and rhododendron at the head of the drainage. Roy's first thought was that a bear cub had gotten separated from its mother and was caught in the fire's path. Black bears with cubs are common in the Cataloochee backcountry, and a prescribed burn can disorient a sow enough that she moves away from the fire without accounting for all her young. He had dealt with that situation twice before in his career. Both times, the cub was fine once the fire passed, and the sow came back for it. But neither time had the cub sounded like this. The pitch was wrong, too sharp and too layered, as if the sound contained multiple tones at once, and there was a rhythmic quality to it, a repeating pattern in the cry that did not sound like distress alone. It sounded like distress directed at someone, as if the animal was calling for help and expected something specific to respond. Roy keyed his radio and told Mac he was going to check on a possible animal in distress below the fire edge on the eastern flank. Mac copied. Roy started downslope. The terrain dropped fast. The drainage headwall was steep, maybe a 40-degree pitch, covered in loose leaf litter that the fire had not reached yet, slick under his boots. Rhododendron grew thick along the drainage, and he had to push through it with his arms, shoving the waxy branches aside and stepping over roots that grabbed at his ankles. The smoke was thicker down here, pooling in the drainage the way cold air pools in a valley, and it cut his visibility to maybe 30 yards. The vocalization kept coming, louder now, more insistent, and Roy could hear something else underneath it, a sound of movement, of something heavy shifting against wood and rock. Struggling, he came around a stand of hemlock and found the source. A large deadfall, 3 or 4 mature oaks that had come down in a windstorm sometime in the previous year, lay across the drainage in a jackstraw pile. The fire had reached the upper end of the deadfall and was working slowly through the dry bark and branches, producing smoke and flame that climbed 8 or 10 feet where the wood was driest, and pinned beneath one of the fallen trunks. Wedged between the trunk and a boulder, something was trapped. Roy saw it and stopped moving. His feet simply stopped, as if the ground had grabbed them, and he stood there looking at what was caught in the deadfall, while his brain ran through every animal he had ever seen in the Smoky Mountains and failed to produce a match. It was roughly the size of a large dog, maybe 80 pounds, maybe 100. Its body was covered in a dark coat, brown, almost black along the back and lighter through the chest and belly. It was lying on its side with one rear leg pinned beneath the oak trunk and its front limbs braced against the boulder, pushing, trying to lever itself free. The head was what stopped Roy's breathing. The skull was elongated, with a pronounced muzzle that extended forward several inches farther than any dog's would on a body that size. The ears were large, pointed, and set high on the skull, standing erect even in distress. The eyes were open and looking directly at him, amber, clear, intelligent in a way that he could not define in the moment but that he would try to describe to me months later and struggle with the words each time. He said the eyes understood him. He said that was the closest he could get to what he felt when those eyes locked onto his and held. The animal understood that he was a separate being with separate intentions, and it was trying to determine what those intentions were. Roy is not a man who freezes under pressure. Wildland firefighters cannot afford that luxury. Fire does not wait for you to process your emotions. But he stood there for what he estimated later was 10 or 15 seconds, watching the trapped animal watch him, while the fire crept closer through the deadfall and the smoke thickened around them both. Then the animal vocalized again, not the same call he had heard from the ridge, shorter, directed at him. A single syllable, low and urgent, that carried something he can only describe as a request, and Roy moved. He pulled his Pulaski off his pack harness and went to the oak trunk that had the animal pinned. The trunk was maybe 14 inches in diameter, not impossibly heavy, but wedged against the boulder in a way that made it hard to shift. The fire was 15 feet from the animal's position and moving. Roy could feel the heat on the back of his neck. He swung the Pulaski's flat end under the trunk and levered upward, driving his weight down on the handle, and felt the trunk lift maybe 2 inches. The animal scrambled. Its front claws dug into the soil and rock, pulling, and Roy could see the muscles under the hide working, thick and defined, stronger than anything that size should have been. He heaved again on the Pulaski. The trunk lifted another 3 inches. The animal pulled its leg free and rolled away from the boulder in a single fluid motion that carried it 5 feet downslope before it came upright. Upright. On 2 legs. Standing. The animal Roy had been looking at on the ground. An animal he had been trying to categorize as an injured canine, an odd-looking dog, a deformed coyote, something, anything that would fit into the world as he understood it, was standing on its hind legs, not rearing up the way a bear does to get a better view. Standing the way a person stands. Balanced. Stable. The rear legs were built for it. Digitigrade. With a forward bend at the knee that looked wrong by human standards but was clearly functional. The front limbs hung at its sides. Not forelimbs. Arms. With hands. 5 digits visible on each. Curled slightly. With dark nails that caught the firelight. It stood there facing Roy for maybe 3 seconds. It was young. He knew that with the certainty of a man who has spent his life assessing wildlife in the field. The proportions said juvenile. The body had not filled out yet. The head was slightly oversized relative to the torso, the way a puppy's head is. The coat was less dense than it would be on a mature animal, and the eyes, those amber, terrifyingly aware eyes, held a quality that a mature predator's eyes would not. Uncertainty, caution. The wary intelligence of a young animal assessing a situation that it does not have enough experience to fully evaluate. Then it turned and ran downslope through the rhododendron on 2 legs, covering ground with a loping stride that carried it out of sight in seconds. Roy stood in the smoke with the Pulaski in his hand, and the fire eating the deadfall 6 feet from where he had just been kneeling. His hands were shaking. The Pulaski handle rattled against his thigh. His mouth had gone dry, and his heart was hammering with a force that he could feel in his temples, and the backs of his hands and the pit of his stomach. He had been in situations where fire behavior changed faster than the plan could accommodate, where he had to run, where the heat got close enough to singe the hair on his arms, and none of those situations had produced the physical response he was experiencing now, because those situations, however dangerous, had been comprehensible. They fit inside a world he understood. What he had just seen did not fit inside anything. He looked up. The ridgeline above him, maybe 200 yards upslope, was visible through gaps in the smoke where the fire had already burned through and the air was clearing. The ridge was backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the residual haze. And against that light, silhouetted with the clarity of a paper cutout held against a lamp, 6 figures were standing on the crest. They were upright. They were large. Roy is 5'11". And even at 200 yards with nothing but smoke and sky behind them, he could tell that the smallest of the 6 was substantially taller than he was. The largest was something he did not want to estimate because the number his brain produced did not make sense. They were broad across the shoulders and chest. Their arms hung long, past the hips, and their heads, in profile against the lit sky, showed the same elongated muzzle and erect pointed ears as the young animal that had just disappeared into the rhododendron below him. They were watching him. All 6 of them, perfectly still, arranged along the ridgeline, not in a cluster, but in a loose line, spaced maybe 15 feet apart, the way sentries would space themselves along a perimeter. And Roy understood. In a single moment of clarity that felt less like realization and more like something he had always known and was only now allowing himself to acknowledge, that these were the parents, the family, the group that the young one belonged to, and they had been up there the entire time. They had watched him find it. They had watched him free it, and they had not intervened. Roy counted them. He counted them twice, because the first count produced a number that his rational mind wanted to reject. 6. He scanned the ridgeline left to right and counted the silhouettes. 6 adult dogmen standing on a ridgeline in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, in the middle of a prescribed burn, watching a firefighter who had just pulled one of their young from a pile of burning deadfall. The largest of the six, the one standing at the center of the line, tilted its head. A small movement, a few degrees to one side. The way a dog tilts its head when it hears a sound it is trying to understand. Except this was not a dog, and the sound it was trying to understand was not a sound but a situation. A human helping a juvenile of a species that the human did not know existed. The head tilt lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the largest one made a vocalization. Roy heard it clearly despite the distance and the residual crackle of the fire. A single tone, low and resonant, that carried down the slope and through the drainage with a physical weight he felt in his ribcage. One note, held for 3 or 4 seconds, and then nothing. The 6 figures turned, one by one, starting from the ends of the line and moving inward like a curtain closing, and walked off the ridge toward the north side, away from the fire, away from Roy, following the direction the juvenile had gone. Their movement was fluid and unhurried. They dropped below the ridgeline and vanished, and the ridge stood empty against the sky, and Roy was alone in the drainage with the fire and the smoke, and a Pulaski in his trembling hand. He does not know how long he stood there. He thinks it was several minutes, though time had become unreliable. The fire was close enough that the heat brought him back. He turned, climbed the slope to the burn line, crossed into the safety of the already burned ground, and walked back toward the crew staging area on legs that felt wooden and remote, as if he were operating them by instruction rather than instinct. Mac asked him on the radio if the animal was all right. Roy keyed the mic and said it was gone. His voice sounded normal to him. He does not think Mac noticed anything wrong. Travis gave him a look when he reached the staging area that suggested something about Roy's face or body language was off, but Travis did not ask, and Roy did not offer. They finished the burn, mopped up the edges, packed out their gear, hiked back to Cove Creek Gap in the late afternoon light. Roy drove home to Cock County in silence, the truck cab pressing in on him, the road unreeling beneath tires he could not feel. He did not tell his wife that night. He sat on the back porch after dinner and looked at the mountains going dark to the south and drank a beer that he could not taste and tried to think about what he had seen and found that his mind kept deflecting, sliding off the memory the way your hand slides off a hot surface. Not because the memory was painful, because it was too large. It occupied too much cognitive space to process all at once. He would approach it, get close enough to feel the implications, and then his brain would redirect him to something manageable. Did he turn the hose off on the truck? Was the gear stored correctly? What was the weather forecast for Thursday? Ordinary thoughts thrown up like barriers against the extraordinary thing sitting in the center of his awareness, waiting patiently for him to stop running from it. He told one person, a firefighter he had worked with for over 20 years, a man we will call Lonnie, who had been on the Great Smoky module since the mid-90s, and who Roy trusted with the kind of trust that only comes from sharing a fire shelter deployment or a close call on a ridgeline when the wind shifted and the fire crowned, and you both ran downhill through brush and deadfall with the heat on your backs and the world turning orange behind you. They had been through that together, more than once. Roy called Lonnie 2 days after the Jesse Ridge burn and asked if they could meet in person. Lonnie drove over to Roy's place on a Saturday morning. They sat in Roy's garage with the door half open and coffee going cold in their hands, and Roy told him everything. The vocalization, the deadfall, the juvenile, the eyes, the standing upright, the 6 figures on the ridge, the head tilt, the single low vocalization from the largest one, the departure, all of it, delivered in the flat, precise language of a man who has been trained to give situation reports, and who falls back on that training when the situation exceeds his emotional capacity to describe it any other way. Lonnie listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask Roy if he was sure about what he saw. He did not suggest alternative explanations. When Roy finished, Lonnie was quiet for a long time, looking out through the half-open garage door at the tree line behind Roy's property, and then he told Roy what he had not expected to hear. He said he had heard something on the Sterling Ridge Fire Road in 2018 during a late-night monitoring shift on a wildfire that had sparked from a lightning strike near Mount Sterling. He said he had been sitting in the truck with the windows cracked. Listening for fire behavior changes the way you do on a monitoring shift, and sometime around 1 a.m, he heard a vocalization from the timber above the road that he could not identify. He said it was low, structured, and came from something large. He said it lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then there was a response from a different direction, deeper in the forest, a similar sound at a different pitch. He said he rolled up his windows and drove back to the staging area and never mentioned it to anyone because there was nothing to report. A sound in the dark that you could not identify was not an incident. It was not anything. It went in no report and produced no follow-up and existed only as a piece of information that Lonnie carried with him and filed away in the part of his mind where he kept things that did not fit the world as he needed it to work. When Roy described the vocalization from the largest figure on the ridge, Lonnie said it matched. The same register, the same structure, the same weight in the chest. They sat in the garage for 3 hours. Roy showed Lonnie photographs he had taken at the deadfall site the day after the encounter, when he had gone back alone on his day off, driving the narrow Cataloochee Road and hiking to the drainage below Jesse Ridge in the early morning light. The deadfall was partially burned. The oak trunk where the juvenile had been pinned was charred on one side, and in the soft soil of the drainage bottom, in a strip of wet earth along the creek that fed into Caldwell Fork, Roy had found tracks. The tracks were canid in morphology. 4 toe pads with claw marks, arranged around a central pad, but the size was wrong. Each track measured roughly 6 inches long by 5 inches wide. A gray wolf, which has not existed in the southern Appalachians for over a century, leaves a track roughly 4.5 inches by 3 3/4. A large domestic dog, a mastiff or a Great Dane, might approach 5 inches in length. What Roy was looking at exceeded the measurements of every canid in the North American Field Guide, and the stride pattern was bipedal. The tracks ran along the creek bank in a 2-footed walking gait, with a stride length Roy measured at 46 inches. He photographed them. He measured them with the tape he carried in his fire pack. He took GPS coordinates. He did everything his professional training told him to do when documenting wildlife sign in the field. Except the wildlife he was documenting had no classification, no scientific name, no entry in any database maintained by the park or the state or the federal government. He found smaller tracks alongside the larger ones. The juvenile, tracks maybe 4 inches long, same canid morphology, running in the same bipedal pattern with a shorter stride. The juvenile was walking upright, beside an adult, 2 sets of tracks moving north along the drainage, away from the burned ridge, heading deeper into the backcountry toward the interior of the park, where the terrain gets steep enough and the forest gets dense enough that a human would need a machete and 2 days to cover what these creatures apparently covered in a time. Night. If you have spent time in the Cataloochee Valley, if you have driven that narrow road over Cove Creek Gap and walked the old fields where the elk graze at dusk, if you have hiked the Caldwell Fork Trail into the deep timber, where the forest closes overhead and the light goes green, and the only sounds are water and wind, and the occasional crack of a branch that your brain tries very hard to attribute to a deer or a squirrel, let me know in the comments, because the reports I have been collecting from that area over the past year tell a story that lines up with what Roy found on Jesse Ridge in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Roy went back to the drainage 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Each time he found new evidence. The tracks appeared consistently along the creek bottom, always bipedal, always in groups of 2 or more sets, suggesting multiple individuals traveling together. On his 3rd visit, he found tree markings, deep vertical gouges in the bark of a yellow birch about a mile upstream from the deadfall site, running from roughly 4 feet off the ground to just above 7 feet, 4 parallel marks in each group, spaced at intervals that matched a hand with a span of about 10 inches. The gouges were fresh. The exposed wood was pale and wet with sap. Whatever made them had applied significant force, cutting through the bark and into the cambium layer beneath. Roy had measured thousands of black bear claw marks in his career. Bears leave marks at heights corresponding to their standing reach, typically 5 to 6 feet for a mature male. These marks were higher. The handspan was wider than any bear's forepaw, and the spacing of the individual claw marks, roughly 2.5 inches apart, corresponded to fingers, not the tightly grouped claws of a bear's paw. He found a second marked tree 200 yards from the first, and a third about a 1/4 mile downstream. The marks formed a rough line running along the drainage. Territorial marking, Roy knew the behavior from decades of studying black bears in the park, an animal defining the edges of its claimed space, leaving signs that others of its kind could read and interpret. The principle was identical. The scale was different. Whatever was claiming this drainage was larger, stronger, and operating over a wider territory than any bear in the Smokies. The broader context of what Roy found connects to a pattern of reports from the southern Appalachians that extends back further than most people realize. The Great Smoky Mountains and the surrounding ranges have produced encounters with upright canine beings for generations, though the reports have never been aggregated or studied systematically, because no institution exists that would take responsibility for doing so. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, whose Qualla Boundary Reservation sits at the southern entrance to the park in Swain County, has traditions involving canine beings that are rooted in some of the oldest oral histories in the region. In Cherokee tradition, the wolf is Waya, a figure of deep spiritual significance. Waya was a companion and servant of Kanati, the mythical master hunter. The anthropologist James Mooney, during his fieldwork at the Big Cove community on the Qualla Boundary in the late 1880s, recorded that an ordinary Cherokee would never kill a wolf, believing the kindred of a slain wolf would take revenge. The wolf was respected as a presence that occupied its own place in the order of the world. Mooney also recorded references to beings in the deep mountains that were not wolves in the ordinary sense, beings associated with specific territories that the old people knew about but spoke of carefully. Humans who went into those places uninvited encountered things that the oral tradition described in terms that sound remarkably like what Roy described from that drainage below Jesse Ridge. When I contacted a member of the Eastern Band's Cultural Preservation Office to ask about traditions involving large canine beings in the Cataloochee area specifically, the response was polite but measured. The person I spoke with would not discuss details of specific traditions on the record. They said that the mountains held things that were known to the old people, and that the old people had protocols for interacting with those things, protocols that were still maintained by families within the community. When I asked whether the prescribed burn program in the Cataloochee backcountry had raised any concerns within the tribal community, there was a pause. Then they said that fire had always been part of the mountains, and that the things in the mountains understood fire better than the people setting it. They would not elaborate. The conversation ended shortly after. That careful boundary setting is itself a kind of evidence. It matches a pattern that Linda Godfrey documented across the Great Lakes region over 3 decades of research into encounters with upright canine beings. Indigenous communities that have traditions describing beings matching dogman reports tend to respond to outside inquiries, not with disbelief or ridicule, but with quiet acknowledgement, followed by a firm refusal to discuss specifics. The beings are known. They are not new, and the reasons for not discussing them with outsiders are rooted in relationships with the land and its other inhabitants that predate European contact by thousands of years. What Roy observed on Jesse Ridge connects directly to patterns Godfrey identified across hundreds of cases. The upright posture, the canine head, the amber eye shine, the group coordination, the territorial marking, and the deliberate restraint. 6 adults watched a human handle one of their young and chose not to intervene. They could have. They were above Roy. On ground they knew. They outnumbered him. Every protective instinct should have driven them downslope. They did not. They watched. They allowed the human to finish, and when the juvenile was free, they departed without aggression, without threat, with only a single vocalization from the largest individual. That restraint implies calculation, not instinct. The kind of real-time decision-making that requires understanding what a human is capable of, and the ability to weigh consequences against the urge to protect a member of the group. Wolves make similar calculations, but on a species level, encoded in generational behavior. What Roy observed was operating higher, individual assessment based on the specific behavior of the specific human in front of them. The human was helping, and the adults understood the distinction. Roy's colleague Lonnie connected the Jesse Ridge encounter to something he had been carrying for years. During a 2018 wildfire on Sterling Ridge that burned about 400 acres, the fire crew used thermal imaging to monitor the fire's progress at night. During 3 consecutive nights, the vehicle-mounted thermal unit recorded heat signatures in the unburned timber north of the fire that the crew could not attribute to known wildlife. Large signatures, bipedal in posture, moving along the ridgeline in groups of 2 and 3. They appeared after midnight and were gone before dawn. The crew logged them as elk, which was the only classification available, and the only explanation that would not trigger a conversation nobody wanted to have. Lonnie told Roy that the crew had discussed the signatures privately. 2 of the 6 crew members on that fire had seen the thermal images in real time and knew they were not elk. Elk produce a thermal signature that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time monitoring wildlife with thermal equipment. 4 legs, horizontal spine, head carried at neck height. These signatures were vertical, upright, with proportions that matched a tall, broad-shouldered bipedal figure. The 2 crew members who recognized what they were looking at said nothing in their official reports. One of them told Lonnie privately, months later, that he had replayed the thermal recordings on his personal laptop and measured the figures against the trees they passed, which had known heights on the park's forest inventory maps. His estimate was 7 to 7.5 feet tall. He deleted the recordings afterward. Nobody told him to. He simply did not want them on his computer. He did not want to look at them again. He did not want to be the person who had them if anyone ever asked. Lonnie told Roy there was more. A trail crew working the Boogerman Loop in Cataloochee in 2019 had reported an unusual smell near a creek crossing, heavy and musky, strong enough that 2 crew members refused to work that section. A ranger hiked in 3 days later and found no carcass, but noted vertical scratch marks on trees at unusual heights. He attributed them to bears. Lonnie had seen that field log entry and recognized the marks. They matched what Roy had been finding below Jesse Ridge. That keeps these observations undocumented is identical to what has been described by witnesses in every dogman encounter I have investigated. The National Park Service's Wildlife Observation Database has categories for every species documented within park boundaries. Black bear, white-tailed deer, elk, red wolf, in the experimental population reintroduction area in the western Smokies, bobcat, coyote, the occasional cougar sighting, which the park handles carefully, because the eastern cougar was officially declared extinct by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2018, and any confirmed sighting would trigger a regulatory cascade that nobody in the bureaucracy wants to manage. The database has no category for an unclassified large bipedal canid. There is no form. There is no drop-down menu. There is no incident code. If Roy had filed a report describing what he saw on Jesse Ridge, the system would have no place to put it. His supervisor would have read it, looked at Roy, and started a conversation that would have ended Roy's career in a building where he had spent the better part of 3 decades building a reputation as someone whose field observations could be trusted. That reputation is the currency that matters most in wildland fire. Your crew trusts you because they believe your situational awareness is sound. Your supervisors deploy you to complex fires because they believe your judgment is reliable. Your qualifications, your red card, your ability to lead other people into dangerous environments, all of it rests on the assumption that when you say you saw something, you saw it, and that your interpretation of what you saw reflects reality. Roy understood that filing a report about 6 upright canine creatures on a ridgeline in the Cataloochee backcountry would not prompt an investigation. It would prompt an evaluation of him, his mental health, his fitness for duty, his suitability for continued employment in a position that requires sound judgment in high-stress environments. The conversation would have been brief and professional and devastating, and the 6 figures on the ridgeline would have continued. What happened to Roy in the months after the Jesse Ridge encounter is a story about what it costs to carry knowledge that nobody in your professional or personal life is equipped to receive. He continued working for the park. He continued doing prescribed burns. He continued hiking the Cataloochee backcountry, checking on the drainage below Jesse Ridge, documenting what he found. The tracks continued to appear. The tree markings continued to accumulate. He found a deer carcass in the drainage in July, a mature doe with its neck broken and its throat opened by a single wound that exposed the trachea and severed the carotid artery. The kill was clean, no mess, no scavenging pattern consistent with any known predator in the park. The carcass had been placed at the base of one of the marked trees. Placed, not dragged there to feed, positioned deliberately against the territorial marker, the way a wolf leaves scat at a scent post to reinforce a boundary. Something was communicating through the placement of that carcass. and the message was aimed at anything that could read it. Roy photographed the carcass and added the location to the growing map he kept in a notebook in his home office. The map covered the drainage from the Jesse Ridge burn site downstream to where Caldwell Fork emptied into Cataloochee Creek. Over the course of that summer and fall, the data points accumulated until the pattern became clear. A territory, defined by tree markings along its boundaries, centered on the drainage and extending upslope on both sides into terrain that was steep, dense, and effectively inaccessible to anyone who was not specifically trying to reach it. The territory covered roughly 8 square miles of backcountry in the heart of one of the most remote sections of the most visited national park in the country. What struck Roy about the territory was its relationship to the elk herd. The Cataloochee elk grazed the valley floor and the lower slopes, and the territory Roy mapped began precisely where their habitat ended. Below that line, elk moved freely. Above it, Roy found no elk sign at all. No tracks, no browse, no scat. In 3 decades of working the area, he had seen elk wander upslope into timber regularly. Their staying below an elevation contour matching the lower boundary of the marked territory suggested they knew what occupied the ground above them. Prey animals learn where a predator claims territory faster than any biologist can map it. 12 million people a year go through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The vast majority stay on the main roads and the paved interpretive trails. They never set foot in the backcountry. The terrain where Roy found his evidence is off-trail, upslope, in the kind of ground that requires a compass and hours of pushing through rhododendron thickets to cover a mile. The creatures have chosen their territory with a precision that suggests they understand human traffic patterns as well as the Park Service does. They occupy the margins, the steep drainages, the north-facing slopes where the canopy blocks the sky. They have built a life in the gaps between human activity, inside a park with hundreds of employees, none of whom have officially documented what lives there. Roy noticed changes in his own behavior that fall. He stopped hunting. He had bow-hunted whitetail on the Cherokee National Forest every October since he was a teenager, a tradition that connected him to his father and his grandfather, and the mountains that had shaped his entire family's identity for generations. In October of 2021, for the first time in his adult life, he did not buy a license. His wife asked about it. He said he was not feeling it this year. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for months, with a quiet attention that told him she knew something had changed and was waiting for him to tell her what. He did not tell her. He could not find the words, and even if he could, he did not know how to say them without becoming a different person in her eyes. The man she married knew the mountains, understood them, was confident in them. The man sitting across from her at the kitchen table in Cock County, Tennessee, knew a truth about those mountains that made confidence impossible. He knew there was a presence in the high country that he could not explain, could not classify, could not predict, and could not control. Something that had watched him with amber eyes from a ridgeline while he held a Pulaski in his shaking hands and tried to make sense of a world that had just expanded past the edges of everything he thought he knew. He stopped sleeping through the night. He would wake at 2 in the morning and lie in the dark listening for the sound he had heard on Jesse Ridge. The low, structured vocalization that settled in his chest. He never heard it from his property. The territory was miles away, separated from Cock County by multiple ridgelines, but the listening became a habit he could not break. His relationship with the mountains changed. He described it to me with difficulty. He said the mountains had been his home, the thing he understood better than anything else. After Jesse Ridge, they became larger. He said it was like discovering that the house you grew up in has rooms you never knew about, rooms with occupants. You cannot go back to not knowing. You walk the hallways differently now. In the fall of 2021, Roy hiked into the Cataloochee drainage for what he intended to be a routine check of his data points. He followed the creek upstream to the second marked tree and found something that made him sit down on a rock and stay there for 20 minutes. The tree had new marks, fresh gouges, deep and resinous, overlapping the older marks he had documented months earlier. But these new marks were different. They were lower on the tree, starting at about 3 feet and running up to roughly 4.5 feet. The hand span was smaller. The claw marks were shallower. The juvenile had marked the tree. The young animal Roy had pulled from the burning deadfall had survived, had grown, and was now old enough to participate in the territorial marking behavior of the group. It was learning to claim the territory the way the adults claimed it, and it was marking the same tree that had been marked by an adult, adding its own sign to an established boundary post. The old marks above, the new marks below, 2 generations of the same species, maintaining the same territory, reading and reinforcing the same boundaries. Roy sat on that rock and looked at the marks on the tree and thought about the moment on Jesse Ridge, when the juvenile had looked at him with those amber eyes and made that single urgent sound. He thought about the 6 figures on the ridge, watching. He thought about the head tilt from the largest one, the brief assessment, the decision not to intervene, and he thought about the fact that 6 months later, the juvenile was alive and healthy and learning to be what it was, learning the territory and the behaviors and the boundaries of its kind, because a human with a Pulaski and 30 years of fire experience had crawled into a burning pile of deadfall and pried a log off its leg. He does not believe they understood what he did as a favor. He does not anthropomorphize them to that degree, but he believes they recognize the behavior as non-threatening, that they filed it away in whatever system they used to categorize human encounters, and that the encounter on Jesse Ridge shifted something in the relationship between the group on that drainage and the humans who periodically move through their territory with drip torches and chainsaws. He told me he went back to the drainage a dozen more times through 2022 and 23, and on 3 of those visits, he found fresh tracks that paralleled his own route from earlier in the day. Something had followed him, not close enough to be seen, not far enough to lose his trail, matching his pace, staying in the thicker timber upslope from the creek, maintaining a distance that was not surveillance and not confrontation but something in between, observation with a quality of familiarity, as if the thing following him knew who he was and was checking on him the way you check on a neighbor whose habits you have learned. The ethical dimension of what Roy has found is something he wrestles with constantly. He sits in his home office with his map and his photographs and his field notes, and he thinks about what happens if this gets out. The park sees 12 million visitors a year. Cataloochee is already growing in popularity because of the elk. If a confirmed sighting of a breeding group of dogman in the Cataloochee backcountry became public, the area would be overwhelmed. Armed hunters would come first, then the thrill seekers with trail cameras and YouTube channels, and the absolute certainty that they would be the ones to get definitive proof. Then, the media, then the lawsuits, the environmental reviews, the regulatory cascade. The Park Service would have to respond. Wildlife management plans would need to be written for a species that has no scientific classification. The Endangered Species Act might apply. Every trail maintenance project, every prescribed burn, every backcountry campsite within the territory would require impact assessment. The bureaucratic machinery that governs the most visited national park in the system would grind to a halt, while administrators tried to figure out how to manage a predator they cannot officially acknowledge exists. And they would suffer. Their survival strategy is invisibility. They have maintained a breeding territory in the middle of a national park by occupying terrain that humans ignore, by moving at night, by understanding human patterns well enough to avoid detection. Exposure would destroy that strategy. Exposure would bring exactly the kind of prolonged human attention that they have spent generations avoiding. And in the gap between exposure and whatever institutional response eventually materialized, they would be vulnerable. Vulnerable to trophy hunters, vulnerable to frightened hikers with bear spray and handguns, vulnerable to the simple, devastating reality that once humans know something is there, they do not leave it alone. Roy knows what they did when the juvenile was trapped in burning debris. They did not rush in. They did not confront the human. They waited. They watched. They allowed the situation to resolve without violence. And when the juvenile was free, they left. The restraint was total. The intelligence was clear. The message, to the extent that Roy is willing to interpret one, was simple. We are here. We see you. We have chosen to let this interaction pass without conflict. The least Roy can do, having been granted that grace, is protect their anonymity, the way he would protect any witness who trusted him with information that could destroy their life if it became public. The connection between the Jesse Ridge encounters and the broader dogman phenomenon in the Appalachian region is supported by decades of scattered but consistent reports. Linda Godfrey documented cases from the eastern seaboard to the upper Midwest, and the behavioral profile she identified, nocturnal activity, territorial marking, camera awareness, coordinated group movement, deliberate avoidance of human confrontation, holds across every geography where credible sightings have been reported. The Southern Appalachians produce fewer publicized reports than the Great Lakes region, partly because the population density in the deep backcountry is lower, and partly because the cultural framework in these mountains has always been more accommodating of things that Western science refuses to classify. In the Great Lakes, dogman encounters are discussed against a background of Steve Cook's 1987 radio song and Linda Godfrey's 30 years of published research. In the Southern Appalachians, the background is older. Cherokee, Scotch-Irish, Appalachian, a cultural tradition that accepts the existence of things in the mountains that cannot be explained and does not require explanation in order to be respected. The 1887 lumberjack encounter in Wexford County, Michigan, which most researchers cite as the first modern dogman report, occurred 3 years before James Mooney began his field work at Big Cove on the Qualla boundary. Mooney's records include references to canine beings in the mountains that the Cherokee treated as real presences in the landscape, beings associated with specific territories that were recognized and avoided. If you lay the Cherokee oral tradition alongside the Michigan lumberjack account and the Bray Road encounters in Wisconsin and the Land Between the Lakes incident in Kentucky, a pattern emerges that extends across the entire eastern half of the continent and back in time to a depth that Western documentation cannot reach. The dogman is not a recent phenomenon. It is not an isolated population in one forest or one state. It is a species, or a type, or a category of being that has occupied the same ecological niche across an enormous range for longer than any European language record can account for. The indigenous traditions that describe it are not folklore. They are field data from observers who had the land to themselves for 10,000 years before anyone showed up with a different epistemology and started calling their observations mythology. Roy retired from the National Park Service in the spring of 2024. He was 57. He had planned to work until 62, but the contradiction between what he knew and what he was required to pretend he did not know had become unbearable. He was conducting prescribed burns in territory he knew was occupied by a species the park did not acknowledge, filing fire management reports that excluded the most significant wildlife observation of his career, leading crews into terrain where he had documented a breeding group of large predators and saying nothing, because saying anything would have ended his career and accomplished nothing. The system has no mechanism for what he knows. The report forms have no fields. The databases have no categories. The people who run the system have careers and families that depend on working within it as it exists, not as it would need to be rebuilt to contain what Roy found. Roy still lives in Cockett County. He still drives past the eastern entrance to the park on his way to town. He still looks at the mountains the way he has always looked at them, with the eye of someone who grew up inside them and understands what they hold. But the understanding has a different quality now. It has depth. It has rooms behind the walls. It has occupants in those rooms who were there before Roy was born and will be there after he is gone, who have survived the removal of the Cherokee and the creation of the park and the building of the roads and the arrival of 12 million visitors a year and the prescribed burns and the wildfire suppression and every other intervention that humans have imposed on a landscape that was never entirely ours. He goes back to the Cataloochee drainage occasionally, not on any schedule, not with any purpose beyond the need to confirm that what he found is still there. The tracks continue to appear. The tree marks are refreshed. The territory is maintained. He has not seen them again since Jesse Ridge, though he has heard the vocalization twice, distant and low, carried across the ridgelines on nights when the air was still and the sound traveled far. Both times it came from the north, from the high country above Sterling Ridge, from terrain so steep and dense that the Park Service does not maintain trails through it because nobody hikes there, and the cost of upkeep would exceed the budget for a section of forest that the maintenance crews call the back of. Beyond, the juvenile's marks on the boundary tree have been joined by new marks on other trees within the territory. The young animal is growing, adding its sign to the territorial language that the group uses to communicate with its own kind and, whether intentionally or not, with the one human who has learned to read it. Roy told me that finding those marks has become the closest thing he has to a conversation with them. He leaves nothing for them, takes nothing from the territory, steps carefully on the trails they use, and avoids the areas where the marks are freshest. He respects the boundaries the way the Cherokee traditions say you should, the way the old people at Big Cove knew to do, long before the anthropologists arrived with their notebooks and their questions and their confidence that they could write down what the mountains contained. Lonnie still works for the park. He and Roy talk regularly. They do not discuss what they know with anyone else. Two men with a combined 60 years in the Smoky Mountains, carrying knowledge their colleagues would dismiss and their employer would use as grounds for a fitness for duty evaluation. The isolation Roy described to me is not social. He has friends, family, a community. The isolation is epistemic. He knows what the people around him do not, and the gap is not one that conversation can bridge. The fire program in the Cataloochee area continues. The Canadian top prescribed fire plan has more units to burn. Crews will hike in from Cove Creek Gap and light ridgelines and backfire down slopes and mop up the edges and hike out and file their reports and go home. The database will record the acres burned and the fuel loads reduced and the oak regeneration stimulated and the Table Mountain pine habitat restored. The database will not record what is watching from the ridges above the burn units, what is moving through the unburned timber in groups of 3 and 4 and 6, what is raising young in drainages so steep and choked with rhododendron that no fire crew has ever been assigned to work them. Roy asked me not to identify the specific drainage where he found the territory. I am honoring that request. The general area is named because it has to be. Cataloochee, Haywood County, the Eastern Smokies, Jesse Ridge, and the Canadian Top Burn Area. Those are public lands with public records, and the prescribed burn program is documented on the Park Service website. The specific drainage, the location of the marked trees, the creek where the tracks appear, those stay with Roy. They are his contribution to their continued invisibility. The only protection he can offer against a system he gave his career to cannot protect because it refuses to acknowledge it exists. The last thing Roy told me, on the last phone call we have had as of this recording, was about a morning in November of 2023. He had hiked into the territory at dawn, moving quietly along the creek on a cold morning when frost covered the ground and his breath hung in the still air. He reached the tree where the juvenile had left its first marks, over 2 years ago now, and found that the tree bore fresh gouges, higher than the juvenile's original marks, nearly as high as the adult's. The young animal had grown. It was approaching maturity. Its marks were deeper and more confident, cut into the bark with the assured pressure of an animal that knew what it was doing and why. Roy put his hand on the tree, on the bark between the fresh marks, the way he had touched 1,000 trees in his career to check for beetle damage or fire scar, or the subtle softness that indicates internal rot. The bark was cold under his fingers. The edges of the gouges were rough and sharp and still slightly tacky with sap. He stood there for a while in the November quiet with his hand on the tree, and the frost melting around his boots and the creek running clear and cold a few yards away, and he thought about a spring afternoon on a burning ridge, when he had knelt in smoke and heat, and pried a log off the leg of an animal that should not exist. He said he does not know what to call what he feels about them. It is not fear, though he respects what they could do if they chose to. It is not affection, though he admits that the juvenile's marks on the boundary tree produce something warm in his chest when he finds them. It is not ownership, though he has more data on their behavior than any researcher alive. He said the closest word he has is obligation. He feels obligated to them. Obligated by the moment on Jesse Ridge when the largest one tilted its head and looked at him and made a sound and turned away. Obligated by the restraint that the 6 of them demonstrated when every predatory instinct should have sent them downslope to protect their young. Obligated by the knowledge that the juvenile is alive because he was there, and did what any decent person would do when they find a young animal trapped and hurt and afraid. Regardless of species, regardless of classification, regardless of whether the field guide has a page for it. They are in the Cataloochee backcountry. They are raising young. They are marking territory. They are watching the humans who move through their mountains with drip torches and Pulaskis and chainsaws, and they are choosing, day after day, season after season, to let those humans pass without confrontation. That choice is the most remarkable thing Roy has ever witnessed in a career spent observing wildlife. And it is the thing he wants people to understand more than anything else about what he found. The intelligence is real. The restraint is real. the capacity for what can only be called judgment, the ability to assess a situation and choose the response that serves the long-term interest of the group over the immediate impulse of the individual. That capacity is real, and it operates at a level that Roy, with 30 years of studying animal behavior in one of the most ecologically diverse parks in the world, has never seen in any other species. The Smokies stretch across 5,000 square miles of the most rugged terrain in the eastern United States, from the Tennessee Valley on the west to the Blue Ridge on the east, from the valley floors where the tourists take photographs to the ridgelines where the clouds catch on the spruce and fir, and the temperature drops 30 degrees between the trailhead and the summit. The park protects over 800 square miles of that terrain, and the national forests surrounding it protect hundreds of thousands more. The backcountry is vast and vertical and in many places functionally inaccessible to all but the most determined and experienced humans. Something intelligent has been living in that backcountry for longer than any written record in the English language. Something known to the Cherokee and respected by the old people, and glimpsed occasionally by the hikers and the firefighters and the rangers who work the edges of a wilderness that is deeper and stranger than the park brochures suggest. Roy's map hangs in his office in Coca County. Data points in pencil on a topographic sheet. Tree marks, tracks, sightings, vocalizations, kill sites, the accumulated evidence of over 3 years of observation by a man who knows how to observe wildlife, and who found something in the Smoky Mountains that no wildlife management plan has ever accounted for. The map tells a story that the park's databases cannot contain. A story about a territory and a family and a young animal that survived a fire because a human reached into the flames and pulled it out, and an older generation that watched and waited and chose to let the moment pass in peace. If you drive the narrow road over Cove Creek Gap into the Cataloochee Valley on a fall evening, when the elk are bugling in the old fields, and the mist is rising off the creek, and the ridgelines are going purple against the last light, you are looking at the most beautiful landscape in the eastern United States. You are also looking at a place where something you were not told about is living and watching and raising its young in the drainages above the valley where the forest grows thick enough to hide a world. The mountains hold more than the brochures advertise. They always have. The Cherokee knew. The old people at Big Cove knew. Roy knows. And if you sit in that valley long enough, in the quiet that comes after the last car leaves and the elk go silent and the darkness settles over the ridges and the only light is the stars above the Cataloochee Divide, you might feel something that the old people would have recognized. A presence, a weight in the forest that is not wind and not wildlife and not your imagination. Something ancient and patient and aware, watching from the high ground with amber eyes, maintaining boundaries that were drawn before the first road was carved into these mountains, waiting for the humans to go home so the night can belong to the things that have always owned it.